Uh, I am not a historian. My training is in philosophy and economics, and philosophers who have some training in social science, I think, can contribute to social science in the way that Richard Miller has called mid-level theorizing. Mid-level theorizing stands between conceptual analysis, the traditional domain of philosophy, and empirical social science. So what I'm going to be doing today stands at this mid-level of theorizing. I'll proceed as follows. First, I'll set out some platitudes from contemporary social science on revolution, and I'll then try to show that there are important logical and explanatory gaps in that literature. I'll suggest some ways of dealing with these gaps by drawing upon the debate on the transition from feudalism to capitalism and subsequent discussions. And I'll then apply my solution to the Greek Revolution of 1821 and explain how it helps fill these logical and explanatory gaps. So I begin with a rough and ready definition of revolution as an effort to transform the political institutions and the justifications for political authority in a society, accompanied by formal or informal mass mobilization and non-institutionalized actions that undermine existing authorities. I quote, "On the one hand, the absolutist state finds that it is in its interest as an autonomous agent to strengthen industry and hence the bourgeoisie. On the other hand, the protection of the material power of the bourgeoisie also tends to generate its political power and hence to threaten the autonomy of the state. The state, therefore, will be somewhat half-hearted in its defense of the bourgeois interest, and at some point, the bourgeoisie will feel the need to go further than the monarchy wants to do. The revolution occurs when and because the bourgeoisie has become so strong that the monarchy attempts to fetter its further development, and also strong enough to oppose that attempt." Now, revisionist historians have attacked this model from every possible angle. They have argued, for example, that the English revolutionaries under the Stuarts were capitalists, but not bourgeois. They have argued that the French revolutionaries under the Bourbons were bourgeois, but not capitalists. They have argued that the classical revolutions can be explained by appeal to clashes of interest within the ruling elites, and that the bourgeois classes themselves tended to be weak and disorganized. And I don't want to repeat these criticisms here, partly because I find at least some of them compelling. So the Marxian model of revolution has largely been abandoned, but more importantly, for my purposes, abandonment of that model has meant that contemporary theories of revolution no longer operate on the basis of some idea of the ruling class and related notions. What has replaced that idea is a set of models from mainstream political science, which their founder, Robert Dahl, calls pluralism. Pluralist political science studies the processes of elite, state, and ideology formation through study of the resources and opportunities afforded to individual or group agents, maximizing their own welfare. This methodology has been largely successful in explaining all kinds of phenomena related to revolution, war, civil war, and so on. There are, however, at least two problems with the application of that methodology to the study of revolutions. First, they tend to beg the question on the origins of elite and group differentiation. Second, they are insufficiently discriminating in that they conflate power with luck. And this conflation is an upshot of their lacking an account of the ruling class. Let me briefly elaborate on each of these two criticisms. First, the absence of a theory of group or class differentiation. I take it that a satisfactory theory of the formation of elites and their coalition making prior to the classical revolutions must offer a discriminating account of these origins. And here are some relevant discriminations from the historiography of revolution. First, feudal versus bourgeois landed property. Feudal landed property is the private property regime under which the feudal lord or some vassal of the state coercively extracts a rent from the peasant, either in the form of corvée labor, agaria, or in the form of tribute, whether in kind or in money. Bourgeois landed property, on the other hand, is a private property regime under which the landowner non-coercively enters into a rental contract with the farmer. This distinction is particularly salient to the study of the classical revolutions, although I think less so to the study of the Ottoman Empire, where feudal private property was not protected by law. But that's a salient dimension. Another salient dimension is the differentiation between different kinds of merchants, pro-monopoly versus pro-competition merchants. So, for example, in 17th century England, a part of the merchant class sides with the crown. These tend to be the pro-monopoly merchants who export abroad and are therefore likely to lose out from greater competition within. Robert Brenner has shown that domestic merchants, those favoring abolition of state monopolies and free trade in the internal market, tended, unlike the exporting merchants, to support Cromwell and the abolition of feudalism in England. And I will argue momentarily that this distinction may yet play a pivotal role in understanding the leadership of or at least a part of the Greek Revolution. Finally, after having talked about landed property and merchants, there are the peasants, rich versus poor peasants. And a large part of the debate in the 1950s about the transition from feudalism to capitalism concerned the so-called middle sort, those well-to-do peasants who rose from the ranks of the peasantry and the old yeomanry of England to become capitalist farmers, that is, farmers hiring wage labor. Similar things happened in France. Now, this form of peasant differentiation is also important, and I'll say a couple of things about it in the case of the Ottoman Empire in a moment. But the first problem with pluralist studies of revolution is that they offer no account of these differentiations, that just take these divisions as given. The second problem with pluralism, I think, is more conceptual. Pluralists think that if a group of people can get what they want, then they have power. It just so happens that ruling elites have a lot more power on a lot more issues than that particular group. But I think this conflates power with luck. There are at least two ways in which a group of people can get what it wants. It can get what it wants despite resistance, the resistance of others, or it can get it because the ruling class allows it. Contemporary pluralism does not draw this distinction, which means it consistently generates false positives. The weak gentry in absolutist France, for example, did not get its way when it did because it was powerful. It got its way when and because Louis XIV allowed it. The gentry was lucky, but not powerful. My point being that if we didn't already have a theory of the ruling class, we'd need to invent it. Pluralist political science, I don't think, can be the complete or last word on the question of the origins and form of revolution. And I come now to more relevant to our issues, more relevant to our concerns, the Greek situation, the Greek Revolution. And you might ask, what does all this have to do with 1821? Greece was, after all, subject to a kind of Oriental despotism under the Ottoman Empire. The Timariotic system did not involve serfdom, so the Greek Revolution didn't have much feudalism to abolish, unlike European feudalism. Greek cities were small and underdeveloped compared to their European counterparts, and industry or even basic manufacturing were not on the agenda for the Greek economy until late in the 19th century. I think these contrasts are valid, but they've been very much exaggerated. For example, although the Ottoman Empire is a kind of Oriental despotism until the mid-17th century, because the landlord and the sovereign inhere in one representative, the Sultan, who is Allah's representative on earth, the absence of serfdom does not make the Ottoman Empire non-feudal. I think, for example, French 18th century absolutism was a form of feudalism. It was an attempt to shore up the feudal state by centralizing tributary taxation, but it was not based on serfdom. And if the conceptual link between feudalism and serfdom is broken, that makes room for arguing that at least the late Ottoman Empire in the West, Rumeli, etc., is a kind of feudal or semi-feudal state. The Ottoman Empire, especially after the 17th century economic crisis, I think begins to look much more like European absolutism than like Oriental despotism. There is no reason to think, by implication, that the Greek peasant under Ottoman rule was free or freer than her counterparts under English or French absolutism. The Greek peasant could neither sell nor rent out her land without official sanction. Moreover, unlike the landless peasant of English absolutism, she was not free in the double sense of freedom to choose an employer and freedom from her means of production. The Ottoman farmer had means of production just because she couldn't choose her exploiter. So the generalized crisis, economic crisis of the 17th century, coupled with the end of territorial conquest and a large increase in population, induced the Ottoman Empire to intensify tax farming and to allow the formation of a proto-landed property, feudal style, on the corpse of the Timariotic system. I think the rise of the Chiflik system is one consequence of this. And I think also the story of this second feudalism in the Ottoman Empire has not very extensively been studied by Balkan historians. But there are three very prominent exceptions to this, namely the work of Spiros Azdrahas, Vasilis Kremidas, and Trajan Stojanovic. In light of this very discussion, Azdrahas concludes that the concept of bourgeois revolution, even if applicable generally, is not applicable to the Greek case. So Azdrahas writes, and I quote, "The Greek merchants had no reason to support an independent state. Economic power did not lead to revolution, since those merchants could benefit from the existing system. They had no reason to want to change it." And I want to argue that if we take a sufficiently fine-grained account of merchant differentiation under Ottoman rule and a more discriminating approach to the constitution of a ruling class, then it becomes easier to affirm the idea of an ascending ruling class for a subset of the Greek merchants, landlords, notables, and primates. At the very least, the idea of the leading middle sort from among a divided Greek gentry becomes more palatable. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, one account of class differentiation under Ottoman rule issues not from pluralist political science, but from good old social history. So here's Vasilis Kremidas, and I quote, "The Ottoman state did not undertake commercial transactions by itself. Rather, it left them to its non-Muslim subjects. Through this process of differentiation of the final beneficiary of the productive surplus and its unhindered appropriation by the merchant, there arose the preconditions for the formation of a second pole of economic power. These processes of commercial accumulation were autonomized to such an extent that they established a parallel economic logic, quite different from the logic predating it." This is my translation from Greek. I think this kind of argument suffices to establish the relative autonomy of the Greek merchant from the Ottoman state, but it does not quite meet Azdrahas's challenge. Why opt for revolution and the formation of a new state and fight for it at high cost, possible high cost to you, when you can do equally well under Ottoman rule? Kremidas adds the crucial premise that these merchants were increasingly dependent for trade with the industrializing economies of Western Europe. This dependence and constant interaction made the Enlightenment incumbent on the Greek merchant. She had to learn both the commercial practices of Western Europe and the ideas of the Enlightenment. Kremidas adds that an independent Greek state would be able to adopt protectionist policies, favoring import substitution, making up for the lack of competitiveness of Greek exports and reviving the domestic market. So what we have here are the beginnings of an answer about the class differentiation of the merchants under Ottoman rule and of their role as an ascending ruling class. Petros Pizanias offers a similar explanation. And I quote, "After the mid-18th century, the Greek elites sent their first delegates, usually the younger members of great families, to establish themselves as city markets from Russia to the Central and Western Europe and in nearly every Mediterranean port. That was the end of retail and the outset of their autonomous expansion to European markets in the direction of their own accumulation of wealth. More than that, it was the turning point of their mental conception regarding the Ottoman domination, which from then on appeared as a threat against their economic power and social influence." Pausanias explicitly contrasts these pro-competition domestic merchants with the merchants favored by monopolies granted by the Porte, the so-called Beratli merchants. And you can see the obvious resonances here with Brenner. There are echoes of Brenner and Brenner's treatment of the English merchants during the English Revolution here. I wish I knew more about the Dutch Republic and the Dutch Revolution of 1566 and they're all the merchants played there, because it's obvious that the merchants had the central role, but I don't know enough about which merchants had the central role and what role they played later in establishing the oligarchy that ruled at least in the beginning of the Dutch Republic. So we have here a theory of class differentiation among the merchants that is beginning to look like a theory of an emerging ruling class. So perhaps we do have an answer to Atrahasis' challenge. I argued above that the first challenge for pluralist theories of revolution is to offer a theory of class differentiation that explains the formation of a new ruling class, one both able and willing to fight in order to rule. But the ascending Greek merchant classes could not do that by themselves. They needed allies, especially intellectuals independent of the benighted Orthodox Church, as well as military leaders. So who were these allies? And it is possible, I think, to separate very schematically 4 different sets of elites vying for power in pre-revolutionary Greece. There's first the old patriciate of Phanariots, the upper clergy, and the hospodars ruling the Wallachian and Moldavian provinces, people like Ypsilantis and Mavrokordatos. Then there are the merchants, some of whom are Beratlis, trading with official sanction, and some of whom are middle-class merchants selling local surpluses. I think the merchants who founded the Filikiteria, the Society of Friends in Odessa in 1814, were largely middle-class merchants. Then there's a group of, that's a third group, a group of ascending landowners and chiflik holders, which includes local notables and primates, as well as some former bandits, such as the Armatoli, who established Armatolikia under the protection of the Ali Pasha. And finally, fourthly, there were Klefts and Armatoli who fought in the Napoleonic Wars and got a taste of Western ideas, but were basically guns for hire. So if Kremidas is right, then the most progressive of these elites are likely to be the middle-class merchants of the second category. And I think Traian Stojanovic, the great North Macedonian historian of the Balkans, adduces further evidence of this fissure among the Greek merchants. So here's Stojanovic, I quote, "The Greek merchant John Prigos, who made his fortune in Amsterdam, complained that the Turk did not realize that the wealth of his subjects is the wealth of his kingdom, and yearned for an independent Greek Christian state that would honor the principle of property. But the leading merchant of Hydra and later political leader, George Koudriotis, declined to join the Filikieteria without written evidence that the conservative Kapodithrias was its directing genius." I think Stojanovic is being sarcastic here. I don't think Stojanovic thinks Kapodithrias was a genius. You know, Kapodithrias was was not Cromwell, he wasn't Robespierre, although he met with a similar end. You know, I think Kapodithrias got stuck, you know, between the progressive merchants and the popular classes on the one hand, and the benighted conservatism of the traditional merchants and the primates and notables on the other hand. The former wanted a republic or a constitutional monarchy. The latter wanted Russian-style absolutism, and incapable of placating either faction, Kapodithrias was abandoned by both. But anyway, these are conjectures. The Kremidas-Stojanovic thesis implies that the progressive, pro-capitalist, pro-competition merchants would take a central role in the revolution. And I think that is close to what we do find. So here's Douglas Dakin, an English historian who can't be suspected of being anything like a Marxist. "The Greek Revolution, a vast conspiracy organized by intellectuals and financed by the merchant classes, which came to include and which gave some cohesion to the military classes, Once the revolution began, every Greek, whether poor or rich, became committed. Peasants, small traders and artisans, monks and parish priests, merchants, ship owners and sailors, and young intellectuals from the scattered world all joined the Klephtic bands and ships. More research by social historians on class differentiation may shed more light as to the role of the middle merchant in leading the Greek Revolution. Such research would also have to speak to the so-called modernization debate held largely among political sociologists, Diamandouros, Vrousalis, Lekas, which elite groups were most receptive to Enlightenment ideas and why. So the modernization debate on this view would have to take place, and perhaps as a subset of the debate on class differentiation. Now, I said at the outset that one of the major gaps in the pluralist political science on revolution is that it lacks a concept of a ruling class. This is because it asks the question, does group X get what it wants? And indiscriminately infers from an affirmative answer that group X is powerful. But I might get what I want without power. Huh? So if the playground bully just allows me to get what I want, then I'm just lucky. So before we jump into Kremidas's bandwagon, we need to ask which groups in the revolutionary coalition mooted by Dakin were actually powerful and which were merely lucky. And we have an excellent recent history of the Greek Revolution due to Dimitris Papanicolaopoulos, which applies pluralist political science to its origins, causes, and outcomes. Papanicolaopoulos integrates macro-historical explanations with micro-mechanisms, and I found that methodology and the way it's applied both refreshing and enlightening. My only quibble with his argument is that it tends to assume what needs to be proven, namely that if an elite gets what it wants, then it is powerful or part of a ruling elite. I think Papanicolaopoulos distinguishes between four Greek elites, as I did above: the church, the Phanariots, the Klefts, and Armatoli, and the local primates. And he says that the first two, the church and Phanariots, wanted to co-manage an empire with the Ottomans, or at least that was one of the available visions of Rumeli. The second two wanted an independent state under the protection of some great power. But again, the fact that members of the second group, for example, the Klefts or the Armatoli, got what they wanted does not mean that they were powerful or that they were part of the ruling elite or that they were part of any up-and-coming ruling class. They may have just been lucky. The hypothesis that a compromised coalition between notables and middle-class merchants constituted an emerging middle class, a bourgeoisie united by common interests in a shared national ideology, has therefore not been refuted, I don't think. So, to sum up, I have not argued that the Greek Revolution of 1821 was a bourgeois revolution. Rather, I argued that this hypothesis has not been refuted, and that refuting it should be on the historian's agenda, or vindicating it. But first, we need certain hypotheses which will tell us whether it's been vindicated or refuted, and we don't even have that yet. An account of revolution in general, and of the Greek Revolution in particular, would have to make better sense of both its process of class differentiation and of the composition and constitution of its ruling class. But now suppose that this uneasy coalition between merchants and primates was something resembling a bourgeois revolution. If that revolution started in 1821, then when did it end? One answer could be 1827. But the establishment of the Greek state did not involve a bourgeois state. Rather, what Greece got in the immediate aftermath of the revolution was a version of absolutism under a Bavarian king. And if the progressive merchants and intellectuals played as central a role in the composition of the new ruling class, then one would expect the outcome to be closer to constitutional monarchy. So perhaps, that's another hypothesis, the bourgeois revolution took place and it ended with the Constitution of 1844, a year after Makarianis's rebellion of the 3rd of September, 1843. Θα σε ξανά βρω στους μπαχτσέδες 3 του Σεπτέμβρη να περνάς. But the problem of periodization remains controversial. Did the French Revolution end with the consulate in 1799 or with the Third Republic in 1871? Did the Greek Revolution end in 1844 or even in 1909? These are all questions that would need to be addressed by social scientists and historians more knowledgeable than I am. What I've tried to do is show that there's still interesting work to be done in these areas, and that the toolkit we inherited from the important transition debate of the 50s and 60s is still usable and worth using. Thanks for your attention.